Hello and welcome to the Car Care Nut channel. So the Toyota 4Runner is a very reliable truck, it's a very dependable truck, and it's a very desirable truck. And people often wonder, well, why is that the case? And the typical answer you get is, well, they're ancient. They haven't really changed much in the last decade or more. So today I'm starting a series on my channel about the 4Runner. We're going to take a deep dive into each component and find out how it evolved and how we got to where we are today in 2021 with reliability and the ancient factor of this truck. But before we get started, if you're new to the channel, welcome. Consider subscribing to the channel. Check out some of my other videos. If you're a returning subscriber, well, thank you so much for watching another one of my videos. And folks, this will be a multi-part series. This is part one, and we're going to be focusing mainly on the engine of the awesome 4Runner. So without further ado, let's dig right into it. So let's start with the history of this engine a little bit, how it evolved to this version, if you would. So the 1GR FE, if you go back and look at the 2003, the previous generation 4Runner to this one, 2003 all the way to 2009, it also had a 1GR FE. But other than the name and the block and some of the odds and ends, there are completely two different engines. And yes, they did take the old engine and improve on it, but they got a little bit too carried away and things went completely different. So let's start with the highlights of the previous engine so we understand where this guy evolved from. So the original 1GR FE was actually a single VVTi gear, so it was variable valve timing, but it didn't have intake and exhaust variable valve timing. It was only on the intake side. So when you look at the whole picture, there's only two variable valve timing gears, and the camshaft on the exhaust side had just a fixed gear. Now the cylinder head was the main change between the old 1GR and the new 2GR. The old 1GR had bucket style lifters, if you would. So the camshaft would rotate and there's a bucket underneath it and the valve sits underneath the bucket. The lobe of the cam will turn and push that bucket down and open it. Very similar to older Toyota engines, very similar actually to a 2AZ FE 4-cylinder engine. The cylinder head was very similar. It was a one-piece cylinder head, very simple, not really much to it actually. However, believe it or not, the older 4Runners could have valve adjustments done. You just change the buckets to different heights and that actually changes the valve clearance. So what remained on the 1GR is the front cover design, if you would, and where the oil pump is. So this engine and the old one was the same way. It had a big cover that it's called the front timing cover. It just closed the engine in the front, and the timing chain and the gears and the crankshaft was all behind it. It just sits dead front of the engine. That design got carried over to the new 1GR, where the oil pump was no longer chain driven like some of the older engines. It was actually driven by the crankshaft in the front. So the oil pump is part of the front timing cover. It just sits, splines right onto the crankshaft in the front, behind the front crank seal. It just sits on it. It's part of the front timing cover. And that design also got carried over because it is actually very efficient. Other things that got carried over is the block and the things around the block. The double oil pan design. There's a sub pan or upper oil pan or oil pan number 1, which is just a stiffening case around the crankshaft at the bottom. And then your little oil pan sits all the way at the bottom, lower oil pan, main oil pan some people call it, or oil pan number 2. And if you've seen the old 1GR, it had the oil filter right here. DIY mechanics loved them because it was super easy to change the oil filter, and that was one thing they didn't like when things changed on the new 1GR. And we'll talk about that when we dig deeper into the new 1GR. Folks, other than changes in the cylinder head, some minor changes here and there, The The cooling system is exactly the same. It has a very similar water pump. Yes, minor changes in the design and looks and routing because some things with the cooling system location-wise changed. But flow-wise, everything was the same. There is a bypass line that runs right underneath the intake manifold. The coolant goes through the cylinder heads on the block and then come back to the water pump. It was a very simple, robust, did not have any heater valves to break or clog or have any issues. So the old 1GR and the new 1GR, they all had continuous flow to the heater core inside the car. They never had valves to seal the inside out. Let's talk about how the old 1GR evolved into the new 1GR, which is this one, which is what this whole series is about in the current 4Runner. When 2003 generation 4Runner rolled out, the 2GRFE, the smaller engine of baby brother of this engine, if you would, the current modern one, came out around 2005 in the Toyota lineup. So that engine was very similar to this engine design-wise, but they improved on it, lowered the displacement a little bit, but the major design change on that engine was the cylinder head. We no longer have buckets to push the valves open. Now we have hydraulic lifters and rollers. Very nice design, very reliable, really maintenance-free. You no longer have to deal with valve adjustments and all that, and it was very efficient. And then the second biggest change was, instead of only the intake having variable valve timing, now the intake and the exhaust have variable valve timing. So now on total on this V6, you have 4 variable valve timing gears, 2 for intake, 2 for exhaust for each bank. Now the 2GR started with this, and now Toyota looked at that and waited until they actually perfected everything. Because if you remember the 2GR when it first came out in 2005, there was problems with the variable valve timing gears coming apart and causing all kinds of issues. So Toyota waited to implement the change because they wanted to perfect that design before they put it in their beloved 4Runner. So we get to the point where they are about to refresh the 4Runner for a new model year in 2010. And that's when this hybrid, if you would, between old and new, proven new now, because new is actually 5 years old at least, but they took the block out of the old 1GR and they simply put 2GR cylinder heads. Not exactly, but 2GR design cylinder heads. So now the old 1GR block has a cylinder head at the top that has hydraulic lifters, self-adjusting, there's no adjustment anymore. It have roller rockers. Everything is very modernized, but proven and tested. So even then, they used an ancient block with 5-year-old technology on the cylinder head. The cylinder head on the current 1GR has a two-piece design. So there's a cylinder head, has the valves in it, and then there's a second part that sits on top of it, commonly known as the cam tower, the cam cradle. It's basically a small thin piece of aluminum that the camshafts sit in and tighten on, and then sealer seals that part to the cylinder head. Now, in some models that was common to leak. In the 4Runner, however, that was not the case because they got these things built to very high specifications where there was no room for error on these, because they've been building this same engine for such a long time that really there was no room for error here. That's why these things, they're really not that known for oil leaks, at least from the sealer. On the front timing cover also uses sealer, or the cam towers. And if all those changes were not enough, let's talk about why they actually moved the oil filter from nice and accessible to all the way to the bottom where everybody hates it. That was not to make people, most people will say, well, to make service harder and all. That was not exactly the case. They did that for coolant flow because they thought if this engine that has an ancient block and an old design cylinder head is not overkill enough, let's make it more overkill by adding a oil cooler. Now, this doesn't have a air cooled oil cooler, if you would. It has a coolant cooled oil cooler, which I think is a great idea because now you don't have to run lines all the way to the front of the car. And actually, in most cases, a liquid cooled oil cooler works actually better than an air cooled one, because if you don't have airflow, you're not really gonna cool that cooler very much, while coolant is always being cooled by the big fan running as long as the engine is running. So the reason they moved the oil filter all the way at the bottom is to integrate the oil cooler. If you notice, right on top of the oil filter, there's this big block behemoth thing. That's actually a heat exchanger. You see two coolant lines going to it, and then oil circulates through the oil filter into that cooler and back to the engine. So those were the only real changes to the cooling system, because they had to modify some of the elbows and some of the hoses to account for that two coolant lines going to the oil cooler and back from it. That's really the only reason they moved that down there, because they did not want to put it here. They put it down there. That's a better spot where it gets oil circulating instead of going all the way up through the front cover. And even the fuel system did not really change much since 2003, believe it or not. This is a return type fuel system. Fuel comes out of the fuel pump, comes here, and folks, return type fuel system is ancient. There is not really any other Toyota, modern Toyota, other than the ancient trucks, that really uses a return style fuel system. It's inefficient, but it's very reliable actually. So there's a fuel line that comes here, goes to the rail, pressurizes the injectors, and then there's a fuel pressure regulator that is vacuum operated. Vacuum operating things are ancient. Modern cars don't really use much vacuum operated essential stuff anymore. Yet, here we are in 2021 4Runner with a vacuum operated fuel pressure regulator. So that fuel pressure regulator, when the vacuum is high, when the engine is idling, it'll open the passage of the regulator to let fuel return more, lowering the pressure in the regulator. When you raise the RPM or you're driving under load, the vacuum drops, that regulator starts closing, builds up higher pressure, therefore you have more fuel to deliver when needed. And then there is another return line, goes all the way back to the tank, the unused fuel, and it just keeps circulating like that. Really bulletproof and foolproof. There's not much electronics to it. Fuel pump comes on, very mechanically operated things. And the fuel injectors, of course, they're electronically operated, just like they have been for the past 20 years. So what about emissions? Most people look at newer cars, we got turbos now, we got all these complicated stuff with emissions. Well, how come this engine is essentially almost 20 years old there, with some updates here and there? Well, they had to add secondary air injection. And secondary air injection is pure for emissions. There is not much to it other than that. It doesn't really do anything else other than improve the emissions. However, in the 2003 to 2009 generation 4Runner, only the V8 had secondary air injection because it was a tree-killing V8. The V6 didn't have secondary air injection. But come 2010, they had to anticipate, wait, we're gonna ride this ancient horse for a very long time, and we were not gonna really change much. So they had to add secondary air injection, and it was overkill from day one because the emission requirement didn't really require it per se. But they did because they anticipated, we're gonna keep using this engine for a very long time, let's overkill it with emission stuff. But even then, this secondary air injection system is probably one of the best Toyota makes and the easiest to service. If you've ever had to deal with an old V8 like the 4.7 liter 2U ZFE engine, the air injection was a nightmare because the valves were buried all the way at the back of the engine, making them near impossible to service and very difficult, trust me. My back remembers those days of leaning over the truck to change them. But in the 4Runner, they figured, how do we make this extremely simple, where it's so easy that every time you replace spark plugs, you're gonna pull what used to be a giant job. So the air valves are right here on top of the valve cover. And the line that goes from the exhaust is right here No complication, no weird routing and going all over the place, none of that. Very simple, it's right here. And then the line that comes from the pump are also very visible and right there. And the pump itself, the secondary air injection pump, is also right there, where it takes you 5 minutes to really remove it and replace it, and life is good. Folks, the engine in this 4Runner is so simple. I cannot believe that we are in 2021. The 4Runner I'm looking at right now is a 2021 model, and this is technology from 15 years ago, and it's still emissions compliant. They had all this time to make everything perfect, and even before they came with the latest version of this engine, every single component in this engine was already in a car for at least 5 years before that. So, of course, this is a perfect recipe for a perfect car, or perfect engine, if you would. And on top of that, it is made by a company that is relentless on their continuous improvement. Kaizen, we all know that, we've heard that, but in this truck, they really took that to the next level. Let me take you on a tour around the engine bay, and I'll show you some of the stuff that we talked about and some highlights of how overbuilt this engine is. Let's start our tour of the engine bay. So this is the passenger side. This is the first air injection valve. So this valve opens to let the air from the pump to the exhaust. That's how these things operate. And you notice it's very easy to get to. One nut, second nut right here, third one over here, and the valve comes out if you ever have to replace it, although these are really bulletproof and they really have that many problems. Another thing you notice is the pipe that goes to the exhaust manifold is very easy to get to. 2 10s here, 2 10s here, and the thing comes out. No complication there. Let's talk about the valve cover. Now, you got ignition coil here, and another ignition coil right there. So the one ignition coil is covered by this. This is super easy to remove if you have to do spark plugs. Over here, you have your oil feed line to the variable valve timing gears. Now, the interesting thing is there's actually a filter here. It's a non-serviceable filter, but it just catches any debris that could go here. And the interesting design is, if you notice, this line actually connects to the valve cover. So it goes inside the valve cover, goes to these 2 solenoids. Now, these are the oil control valves. They control how much the variable valve timing gear moves. Now, if you notice, the oil goes here inside the valve cover. Actually, underneath this valve cover, there are 2 O-rings that pass the oil to the main cap of the camshaft, and then the oil goes through the camshaft to the gears, and that's what actuates them. So if you ever, for whatever reason, you remove these valve covers, you always gotta watch for these O-rings and you get them replaced. Now, over here, you got 1 cam sensor for the intake, and then you got another cam sensor right here for the exhaust. Moving on to the front of the engine, you got 1 coolant hose right here coming straight from the radiator, goes to this big coolant junction. So if you notice underneath the intake, there's that pipe, that's the bypass pipe that goes all the way, it actually comes from the back here, and everything is aluminum except this little elbow, which is plastic. However, in my entire career, I have not seen a single one of these leak. And even though it's plastic and it might get brittle, but when you touch it, it is such a high quality plastic. Not like some of other Toyota plastic used in coolant. This one is really solid. And then you got more coolant hoses going all the way down to where the oil cooler is that we talked about. Now over here, you got your throttle body. It's a nice, simple throttle body, throttle by wire, just a big old motor that opens the throttle plate, and that's about it. Now, the intake manifold sits underneath the intake plenum. Now, many people complain, well, why is this plenum plastic? Well, in my entire career, I have not seen a single one of these plastic intakes on the 4Runner give any issues, even when they're removed. This is very high quality plastic. You will really not have issues with this. Over here, you got your fuel injectors and the fuel rail on the passenger side, 1 injector, 2 injector, 3rd injector right there. And this is the fuel pressure regulator, and you notice the vacuum hose going to it. Very simple, folks. This is old technology right here. And over here, you got your alternator. Underneath it is the AC compressor. On this side, you have your power steering pump. And really, that's about it. The fan is right here, the clutch. And actually, what drives the fan and the clutch is the water pump. So there's no secondary idler that just spins with the belt to spin the fan. It's actually the water pump that spins the fan. And a few more idlers here and there to keep the belt going. And on this side, we have an exact mirror copy of the other valve cover. Here's your secondary air injection. You got 3 coils, you got your cam sensors, you got your oil control valve, and that same oil feed line to the valve cover, and then it goes down to the variable valve timing gears. Over here, this little contraption over here looks a little complicated, but all this is your heater hoses. There's not really much to them. They look like they route a lot, but all they do is just go from the firewall right there, route around, and then go and connect at the back, at the bypass line in the back of the cylinder head. That's all it is, really. This is your purge valve. And you notice it's very easily accessed. It's right here. You got one vacuum line going to the intake, and then this one connects to the metal line that goes all the way to the back to the charcoal canister. Folks, it cannot be any simpler than that. Here's your 2 fuel lines. One of them is supply, and one of them is return. It's as simple as that. And then you notice right here, this line goes all the way across, goes here, and then it connects to the other valve, and then it goes all the way to the pump. Here's the secondary air injection pump. This turns on, it feeds this valve and the other valve, and then the computer controls these valves to open them and feed air to the exhaust when needed on a cold start. You'll also notice this pump will make a noise when you shut off the car. You'll hear like a motor run, just like you hear right now. This is the secondary air injection pump. In the early years of secondary air injection, these pumps would fill up with water when you're not using them and you're driving. So that last run is just to clear the pump of any debris that it caught from driving the car. So that's the noise you hear on 4Runners every time you shut them off. So there you have it, folks. Now you know why the 4Runner is as reliable in the engine department and how this engine evolved to its current version, which is still super ancient, but extremely reliable. And I tip my hats off to the engineers that were able to keep this engine emissions compliant in 2021. In the next part of this series, we're going to be talking about the transmission. We're going to be talking about why is it so reliable and how that evolved as the years passed by. I hope this video was helpful and informative. If you liked it, consider giving it a thumbs up. Make sure you're subscribed and your bell notifications are turned on so you wouldn't miss part 2 of this video when it comes out. Thank you so much for watching my video, and may the Lord bless you and keep you, and you have a wonderful day.